Alright, you guys, here's what's happening. This video is going to cover pages 133 through 143 of Fahrenheit 451. There will be three reading journal entries connected with this section. And the next video will cover pages 143 to the end of the novel. And there will not be reading journals connected with the next section of pages, the final section of pages, but there will be a test on the novel afterwards, and there will be a bonus video called What's on the Test, so keep your eyes peeled for that. So let's get going with today's pages. I'm on page 133. Let's set the scene. Montag has just reached the river. He's on the run. There's a mechanical hound after him. Everybody's looking for him. People's television sets turned on to alert them of the exciting chase so they could tune in and watch too. Because, I know they were sleeping, but it's a really good show. So here we are on page 133. He was 300 yards downstream when the hound reached the river. Overhead, the great racketing fans of the helicopters hovered. A storm of light fell upon the river, and Montag dived under the great illumination as if the sun had broken the clouds. He felt the river pull him further on its way into darkness. Then the light switched back to the land. The helicopters swerved over the city again, as if they had picked up another trail. They were gone. The hound was gone. Now there was only the cold river, and Montag floating in a sudden peacefulness, away from the city and the lights and the chase, away from everything. He felt as if he had left a stage behind and many actors. He felt as if he had left the great seance and all the murmuring ghosts. He was moving from an unreality that was frightening into a reality that was unreal because it was new. The black land slid by, and he was going into the country among the hills. For the first time in a dozen years, the stars were coming out above him in great processions of wheeling fire. He saw a great juggernaut of stars form in the sky and threaten to roll over and crush him. He floated on his back when the valves filled and sank. The river was mild and leisurely, going away from the people who ate shadows for breakfast and steam for lunch and vapors for supper. The river was very real. It held him comfortably and gave him the time at last, the leisure, to consider this month, this year, and a lifetime of years. He listened to his heart slow. His thoughts stopped rushing with his blood. He saw the moon low in the sky now, the moon there, and the light of the moon caused by what? By the sun, of course. And what lights the sun? Its own fire. And the sun goes on day after day, burning and burning, the sun and time. The sun and time and burning, burning. The river bobbled him along gently, burning. The sun and every clock on the earth, it all came together and became a single thing in his mind. After a long time of floating on the land and a short time of floating in the river, he knew why he must never burn again in his life. The sun burned every day. It burned time. The world rushed in a circle and turned on its axis, and time was busy burning the years and the people anyway, without any help from him. So if he burnt things with the firemen and the sun burnt time, that meant that everything burned. One of them had to stop burning. The sun wouldn't, certainly. So it looked as if it had to be Montag and the people he had worked with until a few short hours ago. Somewhere, the saving and putting away had to begin again. And someone had to do the saving and keeping, one way or another, in books, in records, in people's heads, any way at all, so long as it was safe, free from moth, silverfish, rust, and dry rot, and men with matches. The world was full of burning of all types and sizes. Now the guild of the asbestos weaver must open shop very soon. He felt his heel bump land, touch pebbles and rocks, scrape sand. The river had moved him toward shore. He looked in at the great black creature without eyes or light, without shape, with only a size that went 1,000 miles without wanting to stop, with its grass hills and forests that were waiting for him. He hesitated to leave the comforting flow of the water. He expected the hound there. Suddenly the trees might blow under a great wind of helicopters. But there was only the normal autumn wind high up, going by like another river. Why wasn't the hound running? Why had the search veered inland? Montague listened. Nothing. Nothing. All right, so I'm going to stop here for kind of a reading journal stop, all right? But I'm going to stop again later on in a couple pages for the exact same reading journal entry. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So on the left, I note that on pages 135 through 138, there's a rich description of the country. And then on the right, look, I'm asking you to provide two examples of imagery, which is language specifically relating to the senses from the text. All right, grab two examples right from the text that helps the reader imagine the country. Because what we're going to notice in the next couple pages is a very detailed description of the country, which Montague's going to be taking in, and he hasn't been out in this area of the world in quite some time, so it's almost overwhelming. And there's some daydreaming and stuff going on here too, so keep an eye out for that. All right, so keep an eye out for these things. Back on page 135. Millie, he thought, all this country here, listen to it. Nothing and nothing. So much silence, Millie. I wonder how you'd take it. Would you shout, shut up, Millie, Millie? And he was sad. Millie was not here and the hound was not here, but the dry smell of hay blowing from some distant field put Montague on the land. He remembered a farm he had visited when he was very young, one of the rare times he had discovered that somewhere behind the seven veils of unreality, beyond the walls of parlors and beyond the tin moat of the city, cows chewed grass and pigs sat in warm ponds at noon and dogs barked after white sheep on a hill. Now the dry smell of hay, the motion of the waters made him think of sleeping in fresh hay in a lonely barn, away from the loud highways, behind a quiet farmhouse, and under an ancient windmill that whirred like the sound of the passing years overhead. He lay in the high barn loft all night, listening to distant animals and insects and trees, the little motions and stirrings. During the night, he thought, below the loft he would hear a sound like feet moving, perhaps. He would tense and sit up. The sound would move away. He would lie back and look out of the loft window very late in the night and see the lights go out. In the farmhouse itself, until a very young and beautiful woman would sit in an unlit window braiding her hair. It would be hard to see her, but her face would be like the face of the girl so long ago in his past, now so very long ago, the girl who had known the weather and never been burned by the fireflies, the girl who had known what dandelions meant rubbed off on your chin. Then she would be gone from the warm window and appear again upstairs in her moon-whitened room, and then the sound of death, the sound of the jets cutting the sky into two black pieces beyond the horizon, he would lie in the loft, hidden and safe, watching those strange new stars over the rim of the earth fleeing from the soft color of dawn. In the morning, he would not have needed sleep, for all the warm odors and sights of a complete country night would have rested and slept him while his eyes were wide and his mouth, when he thought to test it, was half a smile. And there, at the bottom of the hayloft stair, waiting for him, would be the incredible thing. He would step carefully down in the pink-lighted early morning, so fully aware of the world that he would be afraid and stand over the small miracle and at last bend to touch it, a cool glass of fresh milk and a few apples and pears laid at the foot of the steps. This was all he wanted now. Some sign that the immense world would accept him and give him the long time he needed to think all the things that must be thought. A glass of milk, an apple, a pear. Now, do keep in mind that was a daydream. The land rushed at him, a tidal wave. He was crushed by darkness and the look of the country and the million odors on a wind that iced his body. He fell back under the breaking curve of darkness and sound and smell, his ears roaring. He whirled. The stars poured over his sight like flaming meteors. He wanted to plunge into the river again and let it idle him safely on down somewhere. This dark land rising was like that day in his childhood swimming when from nowhere the largest wave in the history of remembering slammed him down in salt mud and green darkness. Water burning mouth and nose, retching his stomach, screaming, too much water, too much land. Out of the black wall before him, a whisper, a shape, in the shape, two eyes, the night looking at him, the forest seeing him. The hound. After all the running and rushing and sweating it out and half drowning, to come this far, work this hard and think yourself safe and sigh with relief and come out of the land at last only to find the hound. Montague gave one last agonizing shout, as if this were too much for any man. The shape exploded away, the eyes vanished, the leaf piles flew up in a dry shower. Montague was alone in the wilderness. A deer. He smelled a heavy musk-like perfume mingled with blood and the gummed exhalation of the animal's breath, all cardamom and moss and ragweed odor. In this huge night where the trees ran at him, pulled away to the pulse of the heart behind his eyes. There must have been a billion leaves on the land. He waded in them. A dry river smelling of hot cloves and warm dust. And the other smells. There was a smell like a cut potato from all the land, raw and cold and white, from having the moon on it most of the night. There was a smell like pickles from a bottle and a smell like parsley on the table at home. There was a faint yellow odor like mustard from a jar. There was a smell like carnations from the yard next door. He put down his hand and felt a weed rise up like a child brushing him. His fingers smelled of licorice. He stood breathing, and the more he breathed the land in, the more he was filled up with all the details of the land. He was not empty. There was more than enough to fill him. There would always be more than enough. That's where I'll stop. Again, for the same journal entry, because that's that that chunk of pages that contain a lot of imagery. So take a minute. If need, look back, grab. We're looking for 2 examples of imagery. We just had a bunch, so grab a couple, put them on the right, and that's one entry. Back on page 138, he walked in the shallow tide of leaves, stumbling, and in the middle of the strangeness of familiarity. His foot hit something that rang dully. He moved his hand on the ground, a yard this way, a yard that. The railroad track. The track that came out of the city and rusted across the land through forests and woods, deserted now by the river. Here was the path to wherever he was going. Here was the single familiar thing, the magic charm he might need a little while to touch, to feel beneath his feet as he moved on into the bramble bushes and the lakes of smelling and feeling and touching among the whispers and the blowing down of leaves. He walked on the track. And he was surprised to learn how certain he suddenly was of a single fact that he could not prove. Once, long ago, Clarice had walked here, where he was walking now. Half an hour later, cold and moving carefully on the tracks, fully aware of his entire body, his face, his mouth, his eyes stuffed with blackness, his ears stuffed with sound, his legs pricked with burrs and nettles, he saw the fire ahead. The fire was gone, then back again, like a winking eye. He stopped, afraid he might blow the fire out with a single breath. But the fire was there, and he approached warily from a long way off. It took the better part of 15 minutes before he drew very close indeed to it, and then he stood looking at it from cover. That small motion, the red and white color, a strange fire because it meant a different thing to him. It was not burning, it was warming. He saw many hands held to its warmth, hands without arms, hidden in darkness. Above the hands, motionless faces that were only moved and tossed and flickered with firelight. He hadn't known fire could look this way. He had never thought in his life that it could give as well as take. Even its smell was different. How long he stood he did not know. There was a foolish and yet delicious sense of knowing himself as an animal come from the forest, drawn by the fire. He was a thing of brush and liquid eye, of fur and muzzle and hoof. He was a thing of horn and blood that would smell like autumn if you bled it out on the ground. He stood a long, long time listening to the warm crackle of the flames. There was a silence gathered all about that fire, and the silence was in the men's faces, and time was there, time enough to sit by this rusting track under the trees and look at the world and turn it over with the eyes as if it were held to the center of the bonfire, a piece of steel these men were all shaping. It was not only the fire that was different, it was the silence. Montague moved towards this special silence that was concerned with all of the world. And then the voices began, and they were talking. And he could hear nothing of what the voices said, but the sound rose and fell quietly, and the voices were turning the world over and looking at it. The voices knew the land and the trees and the city which lay down the track by the river. The voices talked of everything. There was nothing they could not talk about. He knew from the very cadence and motion and continual stir of curiosity and wonder in them. And then one of the men looked up and saw him for the first or perhaps the seventh time, and a voice called out to Montag, "All right, you can come out now." Montag stepped back into the shadows. "It's all right," the voice said. "You're welcome here." Montag walked slowly toward the fire and the 5 old men sitting there dressed in dark blue denim pants and jackets and dark blue suits. He did not know what to say to them. We're going to stop there for a journal entry. On the left, I note that on pages 139 through 140, Montag sees men gathered around a fire. What I need you to do on the right is tell me, how is this fire the men are gathered around, different from previous fires in the novel? And remember how does Montag perceive this fire as being different? That might be a better way to ask the question. All right, back on page 140. "Sit down," said the man who seemed to be the leader of the small group. "Have some coffee." He watched the dark, steaming mixture pour into a collapsible tin cup, which was handed him straight off. He sipped it gingerly and felt them looking at him with curiosity. His lips were scalded, but that was good. The faces around him were bearded, but the beards were clean, neat, and their hands were clean. They had stood up as if to welcome a guest, and now they sat down again. Montag sipped. "Thanks," he said. "Thanks very much." "You're welcome, Montag. My name's Granger." He held out a small bottle of colorless fluid. "Drink this, too. It'll change the chemical index of your perspiration. Half an hour from now, you'll smell like 2 other people. With the hound after you, the best thing is bottoms up." Montag drank the bitter fluid. "You'll stink like a bobcat, but that's all right," said Granger. "You know my name," said Montag. Granger nodded to a portable battery TV set by the fire. "We've watched the chase. Figured you'd wind up south along the river. When we heard you plunging around in the forest like a drunken elk, we didn't hide as we usually do. We figured you were in the river when the helicopter cameras swung back in over the city. Something funny there. The chase is still running. The other way, though." "The other way? Let's have a look." Granger snapped the portable viewer on. The picture was a nightmare, condensed, easily passed from hand to hand in the forest, all whirring color and flight. A voice cried, "The chase continues north in the city. Police helicopters are converging on Avenue 87 and Elm Grove Park." Granger nodded. "They're faking. You threw them off at the river. They can't admit it. They know they could hold their audience only so long. The show's got to have a snap ending, quick. If they started searching the whole damn river, it might take all night, so they're sniffing for a scapegoat to end things with a bang. Watch. They'll catch Montag in the next 5 minutes." "But how? Watch." The camera, hovering in the belly of a helicopter, now swung down in an empty street. "See that?" whispered Granger. "It'll be you. Right up at the end of that street is our victim. See how our camera is coming in? Building the scene. Suspense. Long shot. Right now, some poor fellow is out for a walk. A rarity. An odd one. Don't think the police don't know the habits of queer ducks like that. Men who walk mornings for the hell of it, or for reasons of insomnia. Anyway, the police have had him chartered for months. Years. Never know when that sort of information might be handy. And today, it turns out, it's very usable indeed. It saves face. Oh, God, look there." The men at the fire bent forward. On the screen, a man turned a corner. The mechanical hound rushed forward into the viewer suddenly. The helicopter light shot down a dozen brilliant pillars that built a cage all about the man. A voice cried, "There's Montag! The search is done!" The innocent man stood bewildered, a cigarette burning in his hand. He stared at the hound, not knowing what it was. He probably never knew. He glanced up at the sky and the wailing sirens. The cameras rushed down. The hound leapt up into the air with a rhythm and a sense of timing that was incredibly beautiful. Its needle shot out. It was suspended for a moment in their gaze, as if to give the vast audience time to appreciate everything. The raw look of the victim's face, the empty street, the steel animal, a bullet nosing the target. "Montag, don't move," said a voice from the sky. The camera fell upon the victim, even as did the hound. Both reached him simultaneously. The victim was seized by hound and camera in a great spidering, clenching grip. He screamed, he screamed, he screamed. Blackout, silence, darkness. Montag cried out in the silence and turned away. Silence. And then after a time of the men sitting around the fire, their faces expressionless, an announcer on the dark screen said, "The search is over. Montag is dead. A crime against society has been avenged." Darkness. We now take you to the Sky Room, the Hotel Lux, for a half hour of Just Before Dawn, a program of Granger Turned It Off. And that is where we're going to stop for today's readings and our final reading journal. So for our last one, on the left, I note that on pages 141 through 143, a fake Montag was caught and killed on TV. On the right, please answer this question. Why was it important for the authorities to fake Montag's capture and death? All right, so think about that one, jot down your answer, and then you'll be good to go for today. Now the next video is going to cover the rest of the book, and it's not going to have any reading journal entries to it, but you're going to need to know the tail end of this book to do well on the test. And I'm going to give you 2 days this week for the test, and I'm going to leave it open all of vacation anyway, just in case, I don't know if someone's leaving early for vacation. It's all going to be open. It's all going to be open. All right. So we'll see you with the next video. Mr. C, he's out of here.